So, good morning and a very warm welcome to the EPC Friday Update, our weekly look at the latest developments in relation to the COVID-19 crisis and the implications for Europe's economy, for society, for European politics as a whole. Each week on this webinar, we discuss what has been happening during the week, how significant is it, what are the pointers to where we are headed next, and we do so in the company of some senior analysts from the European Policy Centre. My name is Jackie Davis. I am a senior advisor to the EPC, and joining me this week are EPC Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg, EPC Director of Studies, Janis Emmanouilidis, and Policy Analyst Marta Pilati. A very warm welcome to all three of you. As I said, we're going to first take a look at the latest development, what's been happening this week since last week's acrimonious EU teleconference of leaders that ended in some bitter recriminations. Have we made any progress? What are the signals as to where the debate over fiscal solidarity in this time of crisis is going? We're going to look at the EU's exit management strategy. Can we see any signs there of the approach that is likely to be taken? And we are going to also look at developments in Hungary. Many of you will know Parliament passing that bill that allows Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to rule by decree. One of our very strong focuses this week will be on the EU budget, on the MFF. Delighted for that reason to have Marta with us. Marta wrote a commentary on this issue over the last week. Many of you will have read it. I'll be talking to her about that a little bit later on. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. We do want to make this interactive. Those of you who were with us last week will have seen how it works. You can either click on the little hand box on the right-hand side of your screen if you wish to ask a question in person. You are all muted for the time being in order to avoid interference. I will unmute you, tell you I've done so, give you the floor to ask your question. Or you can write a question. You click on the enter a question button, write what you want to ask our speakers, and then hit enter. Could I ask you please to only submit written questions via that format? Please don't send them to the event organizers. I'm trying to keep an eye on whose hand's going up, who's written a question, so we need to keep this as simple as possible. So let's see how we get on. Let's hope the technology works with us again. And let me start, and if I could start with you, Fabian, just in terms of where we are. It's 1 week since that very acrimonious EU summit by teleconference that lasted for over 5 hours. There appeared to be stalemate, no clear political signal to finance ministers as to what political leaders might or might not find acceptable. How do you see the state of play now?
I think what we saw last week was a lack of realization that this is not economics and politics as usual. I think a number of the leaders fell back to the kind of national positions which we have seen before. But in the meantime, I think the debate has actually changed between the countries, but also within the countries. In some of the most resistant countries, there has actually been quite a strong opposition to this hard line, which has been expressed with many academics, politicians, even central bank governors expressing that things should be different. And that we do need to think about fiscal solidarity in a very different way in this crisis. So I would say we have had movement in terms of the political debate. What now needs to happen is that is translated into concrete proposals, which are then agreed to first by the finance ministers as a proposal for the council. And that then we actually see these kind of ideas being translated into something which is a reality. It's not too late for that.
Janis, for you, the Dutch finance minister, going back to that point Fabian was making there about the politics have shifted, He said, because the Dutch took an awful lot of flack, both domestically and on the EU stage, for the stance and the language that they were using only a week ago. And he said earlier this week, we should have made it clear we want to help. We didn't do that empathetically enough. Sounds to me like understatement of the year. Would you agree with Fabian that that's more than just, if you like, trying to undo damaging PR, that it does signal a real shift and therefore we have a greater hope of significant progress next week?
Oh, I agree that we've seen movement. What you were describing in the Netherlands was also that 2 of the 4 coalition partners were saying that the Dutch government should act differently. There was a public outcry. You have intense discussions also, for example, in Germany, where you now have also a good number of, let's call them rather conservative economists who are calling for a big bazooka in terms of fiscal solidarity at European level. So actually, I think that we are actually seeing that things are moving, but that means we're moving towards a compromise. A compromise means in this case that we will probably see a mix of different measures, which could add up to a level of fiscal solidarity which could be big enough at least as a start. There is, and that is I think the big difference to where we were a week ago, where there were still some who believe that the status quo might be enough, that what the ECB did might be enough. I think that now there is a common understanding that you need also a fiscal solidarity bazooka, which by the way is interlinked with all the national efforts, the national bazookas, the ECB bazooka with the PEP program. So you need that European fiscal solidarity. Things are moving. It will require a mix, and I guess we're going to talk about that mix in a couple of minutes. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but that's not a quick fix. So even when finance ministers will meet next week in the context of the Eurogroup, when we will have the next video European Council video conference, things will be moving, I think, further, but then again, it will require still some effort to get to the compromise which is possible.
Before we talk about that mix, Fabian, I just wanted to ask you your assessment of the European Commission's role in all of this at the moment. Ursula von der Leyen came under some criticism earlier this week when she described the Corona bond. She said it's a concept that is just a slogan. This went down extremely badly in countries like Italy. How do you see the way forward for the Commission in terms of trying to play its part in leading this discussion and developing proposals to respond to the crisis, but also giving all member states a sense that they're in it for all of them? How do you see, what would your advice be to the Commission for how to get that right?
Yes, I think it is understandable that the Commission has to be careful. The Commission is not able to put something on the table if that is going to be rejected outright. So I do understand some of the concerns around the Corona bonds, but I think the political messaging here went wrong, and I think it is something which needed to be corrected. The Commission has to be shown to be an honest broker. There has to be an understanding that the Commission doesn't stand on one side or the other within these debates, but that the Commission is the institution which tries to find the compromise, which tries to find the way for member states to meet in the middle. And with that comment which was made, it gave the impression that it had already decided on which side in the debate it was standing on. I think there has been a real effort to try to correct that, and there have been a number of statements now. There has also been the proposal about unemployment reinsurance, which I think is a part of also showing that the Commission does take into account what is happening in all parts of Europe. But certainly I think the Commission needs to be careful that it continues to be seen as the institution which can bring people together rather than a combatant in any kind of debate.
I'm going to come to the MFF in a moment, but before I do, Janis, you were talking about that mix of measures, and we heard the head of the European Stability Mechanism saying, again, underlining, he said there is a lot we can do. with existing instruments. But we've also heard Charles Michel talking about the need to be creative, to do whatever is possible within the limits of the treaties. How do you see that mix now? And could you say 2 words about something that had appeared to go away but has come back very strongly this week, which is this question of an unemployment reinsurance mechanism of some sort?
Well, I think that yes, you need to be creative, but at the same time, you need to have everyone on board. So you need to find a compromise with everyone, which everyone can live with. And I think that is why we will, at the end of the day, see this mix, which I have been referring to earlier. And I think, yes, it will include elements related to the European Stability Mechanism, some sort of credit line, which, by the way, would then also open the perspective that the ECB could use OMT, but a credit line which would not include severe conditionality, but low levels of conditionality linked actually to the need to do something about the coronavirus economic effects. So that is the condition which is being put to it. There is no involvement of the IMF. There is no troika for all those who have the past in mind. So it would be a credit line which would be different in terms of what we've seen in terms of actions of the ESM in the past. That might amount to around 100 billion. That's at least what Reglen has been talking about. But you could increase it to even 400 billion. Then you have SURE, which is this new proposal of the Commission, which is a loan-based unemployment scheme supporting national short-time working schemes. So it's providing loans to member states so that they can support people who do not any longer have full levels of employment. We have these systems in place in a majority of member states. They work in different ways, but the idea is to, through SURE, to provide support. The Commission is saying that could amount to around 100 billion euro. Then you have the idea of using, of increasing the guarantees of the European Investment Bank, leveraging these guarantees, and thus being able, the EIB, to provide more support in the context of the coronavirus economic fallout. That could be 50, 100, maybe even more billion euros. So if you add all that, you already have a substantial number in that compromise. And then there's a discussion about also adapting the MFF, but we will be discussing that in a minute. So we're talking about a very complex mix, which at the end, I think, might not be sufficient at this present point in time. But I think that it is a step in the right direction, and you can add things to it as things develop. The important element is that you actually get things moving, that you show fiscal solidarity. And I think this kind of a mix could be the mix which could work out.
Thank you very much. Marta, I mentioned your commentary a little earlier that you published just over a week ago, where you called for the current MFF to be extended to 2021. Can you we talked about this briefly last week, but I'm delighted to have you as the author of that commentary with us this week. Why did you argue that? Remind us of the case you made, and what would it mean in practice if they simply decided to extend the current MFF by a year?
Yeah, so the idea is to have a contingency plan just to make sure that there is a new budget in 2021. Why is that needed? The current MFF ends in December, and leaders are supposed to agree on the next multi-annual budget before December. Now, of course, the best option would be that they agree on this new MFF, especially a revised one, as we see the Commission has proposed to, as announced, new proposals. So, of course, it would be best if leaders manage to agree before December. But we have to be realistic, and we have to say, well, this is unlikely. Why is that so? We see that leaders and national governments are 100% preoccupied with the health crisis and the economic recovery plans that they have to put in place for later on. And this is, of course, understandable, as this is the main issue at the moment. But the risk of this is that in 2021, simply the EU has no budget. What does that mean? Most EU programs would not exist at all because they end in December. So the idea of the contingency plan is to say we agree now on extending the current MFF by 1 year, so that we at least are sure that in 2021 we have a framework in place. And in the meantime, we proceed with the negotiations on the next multi-annual framework.
In the last few days, we have heard much talk from Ursula von der Leyen, among others, talking about the EU budget now has to become, she said, the new Marshall Plan. The new stimulus package for recovery afterwards, that the Commission is now working on new proposals in this area. So would it be enough to simply say, well, look, we haven't agreed on this MFF, we just need to extend what we've got for 1 more year? Attention seems to be turning to this being one of the biggest weapons in the EU's armory for the post-crisis era. Are they not on the right track? Is that not that bazooka, to use Janis's favourite word? Is that not what we're going to need from the EU budget as well?
Yes, absolutely. The point of the contingency plan is not to substitute the new MFF. It's just to have a safety net in case leaders will not be able to agree on the revised MFF. And why is that? For the reason I mentioned, which is there is not political space at the moment for leaders to agree on an MFF. And I agree that, as you said, the Commission President has said that the MFF has the potential to become the Marshall Plan, the Europe's need for the recovery of the next year. This is great, and these kind of announcements presume actually a very considerable change to the MFF proposals, which might come with a larger size of investment and larger budget size. But the point remains, the fact that leaders at this moment don't have the time or the political capacity to focus on two very different things and important things, although related, calls for a safety net to be in place, just to make sure that we don't end up without a budget in January.
So Fabian, is the Commission, in talking about the MFF as the new Marshall Plan, trying to, if you like, run before it can walk on this issue? Is there a danger that it raises expectations which politically are just not feasible and can't be met?
I think there's a danger of that, and I think we should recall that the differences which are there between member states on the MFF continue to exist. It is not the case that the crisis has removed those differences. In some ways, the crisis might actually aggravate some of these difficulties. We have, for example, the problem that the MFF is predominantly financed through a percentage of GDP. We are going to have a big hit on GDP, so the projections we have made for future income, which goes into the MFF, will have to be adjusted in any case. So there's a very complex negotiation which has to be made. We still have to deal with the Brexit gap within the budget. We still have to deal with the new challenges. We have the continuing differences in terms of the overall size of the budget. So yes, if member states are willing to compromise on these issues, then it would be the first best solution to have a new MFF in place. But I think the politics will probably mean that we will not be in that first best world, and that's why we need a second best solution, which is this contingency Marta has proposed.
Indeed, and you mentioned the Brexit gap. If we roll over, what implications does that have in terms of Brexit? And could you just say 2 words while we're on that topic about whether we saw any real movement or not this week in terms of extending the transition period? The European People's Party called on the UK this week to, as they put it, do the responsible thing and extend. Are you feeling that the odds of extension are going up, going down? Where are we with that?
Yeah. I think it would help to have a contingency plan for the MFF, because that would mean we could also have a realistic calculation of what the financial implications would be of the UK extending. I think the logic which was there also in my piece on extending has, if anything, been strengthened, and I think this has been recognized on the European side, and that's why we also had these signals from the EPP, also from others. The problem here is this is about British domestic politics, where the European Union cannot influence what the decision is going to be. I think it is reckless not to extend the transition period at this stage, but I think in the end it will be a political decision, and it will depend on what the UK government and its leadership think is in their best interest. But in my opinion, it will become almost inevitable that we have to move in this direction.
So for the moment, they are sticking to the mantra. There is no reason to extend. I'm wondering as well, there's been a huge row in the UK this week about the UK's failure to join in a joint procurement scheme. There were 4 different schemes launched to procure essential personal protection equipment, ventilators and so on. We didn't join in. The original answer given was, oh, because we're no longer in the EU. Then they tried to blame it on an email mistake. I'm wondering, there's been quite a backlash in the UK at the government being so dogmatic on that. I'm wondering whether that will play in. But Janis, I think you wanted to come in here.
I'm not on the wouldn't be on the UK, so maybe if Fabian wants to.
No. But as we say, we watch the politics here. It's not moving yet, but you think it will move?
Yeah, I think it will have to move, also because I don't think you can make any real progress in the next weeks. So the only option then is to go for no deal, which I think is even more reckless in the current circumstances. And yes, there has been a backlash. And I think when we look at the procurement scheme, whatever the actual reason was, which ended up with the UK not being part of it, I would actually say that in the current situation, regardless of whether the UK is a member state or not a member state, this is the kind of thing we should be working together across borders in any case. So I think the comment that this has something to do with Brexit and the decision of the sovereign country in a crisis, which is clearly cross-border, I think is exactly the wrong response.
Janis, after this, I'm going to come out to the room. So if you wish to raise your hand or write a question, please do. You wanted to react, I think, to the discussion on the MFF. Can you also say 2 words at this point about where we are with the exit management strategy? Is there one yet? What's it beginning to look like if there is? Where's that debate going?
With respect to the MFF, just a couple of points. I think, first of all, if we have in mind that there will be one big Marshall Plan, I think that's the wrong picture to have in mind. The combined efforts at national and European level might equal a collective Marshall Plan, but to have one element which equals a Marshall Plan, I think, is having the wrong picture in mind. The second point that underlines what Marta had been saying in terms of the political likeliness of getting to an MFF, a revised MFF proposal early on, I think she's right, is very low, the chances of that happening. Because if you go now into a second attempt to strike a compromise, actually you would have to have extremely high chances that you would come up with a consensus among the 27. So if you go into a second round of drama after what we witnessed in February, which actually was not that much of a drama, you would have to be confident that you would have an MFF proposal idea on the table which actually can find consensus among all member states. And I think that the chances of that happening quickly are very low. And adding to that, it has become even more difficult, I think, during this week, after what we see what happened in Hungary.
There is hang on, we're going to come back to Hungary in a moment, but there is a question relating to this, Marta, coming in from Isabel Johansson. She says, what are the chances, you talked about a new compromise, the chances of getting agreement are very low, but she says, what are the chances member states can reach agreement on a rollover? She mentions particularly the rebate issue and how contentious that has been. What would you see are the odds on getting agreement on that? And there's also a question relating to whether we'll get, do you think there is a bigger chance for the creation of a new own resources now that there is a bigger hit on the GDP, that issue that was mentioned by Fabian, that's coming in from Alice Rouquette. Marta, a reaction on those two, if you would, please.
Yes, so it's not to say that the rollover, it's a done deal, that's for sure. Member states will still have to agree on that. But I think the chances are much higher than to an agreement to the whole package for the next 7 years. Why is that? I think the member states are now in emergency mode. So the argument that could be made is it's now an emergency situation. We need a new budget framework in place in January, because otherwise all the programs stop. You need to put aside your MFF positions for just 1 year, agree to this, and then postpone the negotiations to later on, or at least continue the negotiations in parallel, but agree now to avoid the worst case scenario. And I think that's an argument that could be made given the emergency situation in which we are in. On own resources, that's an issue, of course. Most of the budget is financed through contributions that come from the member states, and that's based on GDP or GNI. As GDP goes down, the contributions will relatively become bigger. So there is space for finding new ways to finance this. And I would like to mention an innovative proposals that has been mentioned in these past weeks, days, also by the former ECB Vice President Costanzo. There is a scope for the Commission to borrow money on the market to fund some special EU budget programs, so that they would this loaned money would fill in member states' contributions, at least in part, so that we can overcome the burden on member states, pay for EU budget programs with borrowed money, and then the member states would pay this back through larger contributions in later years once they're recovered. And importantly, this would affect just their deficit expenditures, not their overall debt level. So that would also help in terms of fiscal sustainability of public finances.
Okay, let's go out to the room and take some verbal questions now. Stephen Erlanger, can you hear me? Stephen? No, I've lost you. Stephen, put your hand up again and I'll try again, if you could. Okay, I'll come back to you in a minute. John Palmer.
I'd like to say, can you hear me?
We can hear you beautifully. Lovely to hear your voice.
Firstly, thank you for the excellent reporting and analysis by your colleagues. I want to pursue the question that Fabian raised about the impact of the corona crisis on British thinking about a postponement or delay, an extension of the negotiations. The feeling increasingly in London is that this is going to be inevitable. They're looking for a cover, and the cover, of course, can be provided by the growing problems of handling the corona crisis in the particular circumstances here. My question is, the issues, call it the Marshall Aid strategy or whatever, raised by both Janis and Fabian and also by Marta, is something that will have additional strength if not only the member states, whose decision of course it is exclusively, but those countries with a close economic relationship with the EU. I'm thinking of Norway, and yes, theoretically, of Britain, perhaps also some of the candidate member states. Do you think, in order to get the multipliers working as far as possible, countering a potential slump, transiting to a new phase of growth after this shock, that is something worth including in the broader remit of what the Council, European Council, has to consider?
Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions here now, so that we can cover as much ground as possible, and some may overlap with each other. So let me come back now. Stephen, it was my fault. I hit the wrong button earlier. Let me try again. Oh, you're self-muted, Stephen. That's the problem. I can't unmute you because you're self-muted. So I'll give you a moment to try and fix that. And let's try Hannala Raikkonen. Hannala, you have the floor.
Well, yes, thanks a lot. And first of all, thanks a lot for this great Friday update. I just had a very simple question regarding the MFF. Would you have any idea of the timetable from the Commission side when they might be coming out with the new proposal? Thank you.
Thank you. And Shannon, I can't pronounce this properly.
Yes, it's Shannon Foman. Thank you. Yes, I had a question relative to the social realm. So I'm working at Caritas Europa, and we're quite concerned that the nonprofit social enterprises who have been quite active in the past in helping people far from the labor market access employment and are one of the fastest to be hit and impacted now by the coronavirus, as well as nonprofit social organizations or charitable organizations, whether the funding for them is going to continue, especially considering that they're one of the most active in terms of responding to the most vulnerable in our society, and right now in the midst of the coronavirus, and whether you know not only what's going to happen with them in Europe, but also whether you've heard of governments who in Europe are considering cutting their development budgets in order to allow more funding for European concerns. If you could speak on that, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I should have said earlier, I'm seeing one question coming in, a written question on the European Green Deal. We do plan, the EPC published a commentary on this issue this week, and we plan to devote some time to that topic in our session next week, so we can go into it in some depth. So if you can hold fire with that one, it is something we will come back to. I'm going to try Stephen once more. Oh no, he appears now to be offline, so it's not working. Henry, I'm going to try, hang on a minute, Joe Linen.
Jackie, can you hear?
I can, hello? No, I haven't got Joe. Let me try Stephen again, hang on. No, Stephen, you're doing, it says you're offline. It really won't talk to us. Joe, do I have you there?
But it doesn't matter. Can you hear me? Can you not hear me?
Indeed I can.
Okay, good. Simple question to all of you, and I'm sorry for this technical confusion. It must be lockdown depression. Should the People's Party throw out Hungary or not?
Okay, we're going to come back.
What do you think?
We're going to come back to Hungary in just a moment.
Okay, well, ask that blunt question and I'd be grateful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. That's a question we're going to come back to in just a moment. I'm going to stop there because we need time for that discussion. And there's already, there's a number of questions relating, again, Marta, to the timeline, not the timeline for what you were talking about, the rollover, but if there are to be new proposals, do we know when they are likely to emerge? Is the Commission now already actively developing those ideas? Where are we? What can we expect when?
There is a bit of uncertainty on this. The Commission hasn't been very clear. The works are ongoing. Some are saying that the proposals will come out in the coming weeks. So of course, it makes sense that the sooner the better, given that the MFF, a revised MFF, should be part of the response to the health crisis. But I'm afraid I don't have more details on this.
Okay, so it's a sort of watch this space for the moment. John Palmer's question, I don't know who can pick up on this in relation to if we are to turn the budget into some sort of Marshall Plan, could it involve more than just EU countries? Could it be broadened to the neighbouring countries? And what implications might that have? Who can pick up on that for me? Janis?
I think Fabian had raised it.
Fabian, thank you.
I think the more the merrier. I mean, clearly, in a crisis like this, it's also about firepower. And the more firepower you have, the better you can address the issues which are there. I would even extend this beyond the the European Union and Europe more widely, I would also talk about the global dimension here. I think it is important that we keep the global dimension in mind, both in terms of the overall stimulus response. There is coordination among G20. I think this is very important that we continue to also play a role in that as the European Union. And this also links to the other question on development. I think we have to be aware that while this crisis is hitting Europe very badly, it is also hitting other parts of the world. And some of those parts of the world are less able to cope with the situation. And we need to also start thinking about how we can have a global effort to reduce the impact of this crisis as much as we can, in terms of the healthcare response, but also in terms of the economic response, which will need to come. That is because we have a global responsibility and we should take that global responsibility seriously, but also because there has to be a bit of enlightened self-interest here. If we continue to have big problems in other countries, we get issues around migration, around a global slump. So there's many issues where cooperation across borders continues to be even more necessary now.
Which also links to the question about development funding and social funding. Can anyone pick up on that? Janis.
Yes, happy to do so. Let me just share one additional point with respect to the timetable on the MFF. Marta is right, obviously, there's already work going on and thinking happening within the institutions, but at the end of the day, when to come up with a potential new MFF revised proposal, that I think at the end of the day will be a political decision. And I think it will very much depend on what kind of package mix we will get with respect to the fiscal solidarity compromise. So how big will it be? What will it include? And second, it will obviously depend on the political assessment of how big the chances are to get a revised proposal through. That is an assessment which comes from the Commission itself, but obviously it also comes from member states and from key member states. And if the indications are we don't see that we are ready to do so, I think the Commission also has to take that into account. With respect to the social realm, unfortunately, if you look back into experiences of previous economic crises, if you look back into 2008, 2009, we see that non-profit enterprises, charity organizations were negatively affected by that. And I think that chances are high that that will repeat itself. If you see and look into scan the national reactions to the potential economic fallout of COVID-19 crisis, it is mostly concentrating on other elements. It's concentrating on companies, big enterprises, but also self-employed. So that is where most efforts are going into. It is not concentrating on the organization raised by Shannon. And in terms of development policy, because that's linked to it, I fully underscore what Fabian was saying. I think we need to early on, which means already now, think of how we're going to help those world regions which will be hit, potentially hit, or probably will be hit by COVID at a later point in time. We've seen how it has been spreading. If you look into the map, how it has been spreading, there are some regions which have not been affected, especially as much, at least, for example, in Africa, but also in South America. And as Europeans, we should prepare ourselves to support these countries, these regions, and do that early on.
Thank you. Marta, I'm going to let you go when we move on to our discussion about Hungary. But just in terms of the way forward, there's one very specific question. In practice, how would the extension of MFF work? Would contributions be calculated for 2021 using the previous key? Do we know anything? I mean, how do you do that in practice? Briefly, if you would.
Yes, very briefly. So there is a treaty provision on this, which says that if there is no agreement on the next MFF, then the ceilings of the last year of the previous MFF would apply to the year afterwards. What that means is that the ceilings for 2020 would be applied automatically to 2021. The issue is that the legal basis of programs expires in December this year. That's why there's need for contingency legislation to lift those time limits so that it can be pushed to 2021. The contributions, that it's up to the council to decide every year. They decide exactly what commitments, how commitments are allocated based on the ceiling. So they would have to do that this year as well. So the contributions are up for discussion, but importantly, these are decided by qualified majority and not unanimity.
Okay, thank you very much. And Marta, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to future commentaries on this very topic. So thank you very much. Fabian, Janis, can I turn to the question of Hungary? Stephen Erlanger there asking a very straightforward question. Should the EPP throw them out? The EPC is due to publish a commentary on this very topic imminently. In terms of the EU's response to what happens this week, the European Commission's response, not naming Hungary directly, while nevertheless emphasizing the importance of sticking to the EU's fundamental values, that measures must be proportionate. Then there was this statement signed by many countries underlining very much that we need to strengthen the rule of law in times of crisis rather than weakening it. However, somewhat undermined, it would seem, by some spectacular trolling by Hungary, who themselves signed up to this statement because it didn't name them in person. How do you see the EU's response so far, the Commission, the EPPs, and what do you think will and should happen next? Janis, first, please.
That's not an easy one. First of all, what happened in Hungary itself, the moves which Viktor Orban, Fidesz government did, actually did not caught us by surprise. We've seen in the past that when there are chances to extend executive powers, Viktor Orban has either created them or has used these chances in a very opportunistic way. So that's what they have done again this time around. If you look into the bill extending the state of emergency, that means that the government can rule by decree. There's no sunset clause, so it would last for however long the government, the parliament, and Fidesz has a strong majority in the parliament decides to do so. There won't be elections, no rallies. So the checks on the government's powers have been even further limited. That comes as no surprise, and the initial reactions to it have been, to put it diplomatically, mildly. The fact that Ursula von der Leyen, yes, made a statement but didn't refer to Hungary. I think she could have made that statement, also indicating that in general emergency measures can only be temporary, but she could have made a reference also to the Hungarian government in terms of how they have overstepped what the government should be doing. The joint statement you mentioned by a good number of countries and others, then adding to that, including now also Hungary, the fact that it didn't mention Hungary, that mentioned what the Fidesz government did, has opened the door for the government of Viktor Orban to align itself with that statement, thus undermining its effects. We've also seen a letter from Tusk, an internal letter in the EPP, indicating that this might have consequences. But going back to Stephen's question, we have seen that in the EPP there has not been a majority, or a majority big enough to expel Fidesz from the EPP. I think now the tide is turning even more towards those who are in favor of expelling Fidesz from EPP. Question is, one, could that happen? That decision has been taken, has to be taken by a special EPP council. That will, the next meeting is in June. But we've seen up till now that some of the biggest parties in the EPP, including the German CDU-CSU, have been against expelling Fidesz. But we see that there is now also within some of these parties who have not been ready to support the expel of Fidesz is now also changing. You have an increasing number of people within this party being critical of what's being done. So I think we're moving in that direction. Question is, how fast will it happen?
Fabian, your response on this, how fast should it happen? Politically, how fast can it happen? Again, given that many countries preoccupied with the immediate impact of the crisis, do they need to move really quickly on this? Or do they need to say, okay, we see what happens in the immediate aftermath of the peak of the crisis. Does this get relaxed? It is open-ended, it is without time limits of what the Parliament have passed. Or do they have to act now? Do they have to send a very strong signal now, do you think?
I think it is important that there is a strong signal and that it is clear now that certain things are just not acceptable at the European level, and that we do live in a European Union which puts a high value on democracy, on fundamental rights. Of course, in an emergency like this one, there are actions at the national level which are inevitably reducing people's mobility, having a big impact on people's rights at this stage. But what has to be clear is that this is an emergency and it's temporary, and that we have still got rules around how we apply these. Hungary has gone beyond those rules. But I think what is also important is that we are very careful to make the point that this is the Hungarian government, this is Fidesz, it is not Hungary as a country, and we should try to do whatever we can to still make sure that support, help, that Hungary and the Hungarian people are not excluded from European action. Yes, that is difficult because the Hungarian government sits in the middle, but the message here should clearly be about the behavior, the politics of a particular party, of a particular government in power, and not about singling out particular countries within this.
Yeah, and can I also ask about the impact of this on the other issues we've been talking about? We've been talking about the MFF, we've been talking about fiscal solidarity and the developments there. Do you see a knock-on effect from this argument with Hungary into Hungary's behaviour on those issues, and therefore on the capacity of the EU to respond? Is that another reason for, at the moment, handling it quite carefully? Janis.
Yes, there is a potential knock-on effect. You mentioned the MFF, and we were discussing it extensively earlier. If you want to have an agreement on the MFF proposal or revised MFF proposal, you need to have an agreement among all member states. One element in the MFF, also in the old proposal, was to use the MFF also to set conditions with respect to the obedience to the rule of law. And now imagine if you have this discussion in the upcoming months on a revised version of the MFF, and now you have this political standoff, or an increasing political standoff with the Hungarian government. That would make things more difficult. If you have a strong escalation of the current situation, and you even have that, let's assume, at the level of the European Council, if you would have that, turning back to normality after that kind of a political escalation at the highest political level is not doable. So that is obviously something which is keeping member states' government from going to the extreme. However, and Fabian was right when he said we need to show a strong signal, because we've seen also in the past that Viktor Orban Fidesz has backtracked when it has seen that there was a strong opposition from the outside. They have, at the end of the day, not gone as far as they were trying to go. Now they're calculating this. I think that we've seen often that Viktor Orban and Fidesz has been politically outmaneuvering us, so that's probably in their calculation, but at the same time putting pressure for them to go a step back, and they already did this, for example, with respect to the role of mayors. So that is important. And I think another issue is important. If you don't send a strong signal now, this might also have an effect in other member states. and that there might be other governments, other leading political parties who might want to follow even more suit of what Orban and Fidesz have been doing in Hungary.
Well, I wanted
to send a strong signal now, that would be negative.
I wanted to come to that point because there was a question submitted by the audience last week that I parked for this discussion, more broadly about what impact might containment measures so far in several EU countries have on liberal democracy in Europe, and does the experience so far, looking globally, suggest that authoritarian regimes are more effective at responding to this crisis? And if it does, what implications does that have? So on this broader level, Fabian, the impact on our democracy, on the way we are run, do you see significant lessons being drawn, and what implications that might have?
It is very important that we are careful, that the powers which are now being used by pretty much all governments, not just in Europe, but across the globe, are there because we are in an emergency. And that is also why this issue of temporary powers is so important. It is about reacting to a situation where you need to take action, and some of that action does infringe on individual people's rights. Inevitably, if we are telling people that they cannot move, then that is one of the biggest restrictions we can actually impose on people. But what we need to have is the right kind of systems whereby there is also still scrutiny, that there is also still the possibility to challenge some of that in front of courts of law, and a real guarantee that in the end this is compatible with the constitutions of liberal democracies. In those circumstances, I actually don't think that liberal democracies are necessarily worse at dealing with these kind of situations. If you have a situation where, for example, individual rights are completely suspended, that will also lead to situations where people try to avoid scrutiny, where they try to avoid engaging with official authorities. So you get a lot of things happening in the shadows, which in a crisis like this is extremely dangerous. But I think it is a threat we need to continue to keep seriously. And as we have seen in Hungary, we also have to take into account that some governments, some politicians, some regimes might try to use this to further different means. And then there has to be a robust response.
Which brings me, and I'd like to really, Janis, bring us back full circle to where we started, because I wanted to come back to Italy, and I wanted to come back to the question of the perception in Italy of how the EU has responded to this crisis, not just on the fiscal solidarity question, but with those medical equipment export bans, which were subsequently lifted. The response, it seems, from the EU side has improved. A lot more is being done by member states to help Italy now. But an opinion poll at the end of last month suggested 72% of Italians thought the EU had done nothing to help. Trust in the EU was at 25%. This is a country traditionally very much a pro-European country. And I'm just wondering, what can the EU do? Is it a question of being more visible about what it's doing to help? Is it a question about the language it uses? I don't know, because otherwise we may see, going to that broader political implications, this being a gift to Matteo Salvini when we come to the next Italian elections, a gift to the far right in many countries, a perception once again the EU has let us down. So what can the EU do about it beyond the actual measures of solidarity it's beginning to show? Do we need some sort of bazooka here that will get that message across?
Well, perceptions matter. And I think Italy has been among those member states where the appreciation for the European Union has gone down for a while. And that has now been gotten worse during the COVID-19 crisis. Also, if you look into the first reactions, as you were mentioning, for some good reasons, especially the medical, the ban of exports was something which sent exactly the wrong signal. Now, things have improved in terms of showing solidarity with Italy, but also with other countries strongly affected by the virus. However, I think that's not enough. At the end of the day, the economic fallout which Italy will experience will be big. It will also be big in other member states, but it will be severe also in Italy. So there is a link to what we were discussing in the beginning. If you don't strongly show fiscal solidarity to Italy, and you won't show that mainly for solidarity reasons, pure solidarity reasons, you will have to show it because it is in your enlightened self-interest to show that kind of support for Italy. If you don't show that kind of support, I fear that all those who are now arguing in Italy and also exploiting these feelings which are now increasing in the country will prevail. So you need to have a strong response.
Okay. I'm going to squeeze in, if I might. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to squeeze in one more question if I can. He's been waiting a long time, so I hope he's still with us. Hendrik Bourgeois, are you there?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Can you make it a quick one, Hendrik, and I'll get a quick reply from Fabian before we go.
For sure. I'm sorry. I've been in the queue for a while. And it goes back to the initial part of the discussion. The question I had was, when you compare what the EU is doing to deal with the current crisis with the EU actions back in 2008 with the Eurozone crisis, isn't there a problem of legitimacy for the EU now to have a stronger action? Because at the time, one of the essential projects of the EU were at risk, which was basically the euro. And it seems to me we don't have that situation now. And so, do you have any views as to why or whether the EU is challenged by a legitimacy issue to act on behalf of all of its member states to address the crisis?
Thank you, which links really to what we were just talking about in relation to Italy. Fabian, it's a big question, but it's going to need a small response this time. I'm sure it's something, we had some other questions linked to this earlier. We will come back to it in future programs, but a quick response now, if you would.
Yes, I'm sure we will return to this in future as well. But for me, there's really a one-word answer, and that is interdependence. We live in a world now where whether it's on the healthcare front, whether it is on the economic front, whether it's on the social front, we are very much interdependent. What happens in Italy will affect the rest of Europe. What is happening in the rest of Europe will affect Italy. So the only thing we could do is ignore that interdependence, which would just aggravate the negative effects we're seeing, or we try to address it jointly. And for me, that is legitimacy enough.
Thank you very much. And indeed, on that question of interdependence, the EPC has also published a commentary this week on the international dimension of interdependence. So do take a look at that. We'll come back to the international dimension in future programs. We are, as I said at the start of today, we will come back on this question of the European Green Deal. I know there was a question, and apologies I didn't take it today, but we do want to explore that in some depth in our program next week. I managed to squeeze many of you in. A few people still have their hands up. I didn't quite get to you all, so apologies for that, but thank you very much for joining us again. Thank you for your questions, your comments. I should say we will see you next week, same time, same virtual place, one small difference. We are going to hold our weekly update on Thursday instead of Friday in order to give you some time off and ourselves indeed over the Easter break. So we look forward to seeing as many of you as can join us at 11 o'clock next Thursday for our next weekly update. And in the meantime, stay safe, take care. Thank you, Janis. Thank you, Fabian. And thank you to you all.
Thank you.